colleagues who are on the platform to please switch on their videos so that we can be able to establish if we are good to go in terms of the visuals that we'll be providing as the session is going to be broadcast. As the session is going to be live streamed and also recorded for later broadcast on Parliament TV, which is on DSTV channel 408. Can colleagues who are on the platform kindly assist us with that? I'm not seeing names changing, colleagues. I'm not sure if was not audible. We start off with the, as you can see on my name, it's SADC PF, then followed by my name, Modise Kabedi. If you are coming from a Parliament, then you can just write the name of the country and then followed by your name. If you are representing maybe a PVO that is got a different name, separate from the Parliament, then you can write the name of the PVO and yeah. But it's the name of the, we usually use the country and then followed by your first, full names, please. Can we also switch on the video so that we are able to establish if we are ready for the session? It's now 10:05. I'm told that the facilitator of the meeting is delaying a little bit, but if we are good to go, we can start and then he'll join the meeting as we go along. Our facilitator for today is going to be Mr. Jason Braganza from Aphrodite. He's finishing off another meeting and will join us shortly as soon as he's done with that other session.
Mr. Modise, thank you for that. If we may proceed, as you know, we are on transit and we don't have much time.
Thank you very much, Madam SG. Without wasting any time, let me hand over to Her Excellency, Madam SG of the SADC PF, May Buemo Sohoma, to do the opening and welcoming remarks. Over to you, SG. Thank you. You are muted, SG.
Apologies for that. Apologies, Mr. Modise.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to this morning's consultative session on the model of a public financial management. Allow me to establish the protocol for today's meeting that will be facilitating us throughout the meeting. Let me recognize our keynote speaker, Ms. Barbara Ditapo, who is the clerk of the National Assembly of Botswana, the chairperson of the Committee of Clerks at the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Allow me to also recognize the legal drafter of the SADC Model Law on Public Financial Management, in whom I'm pleased, Dr. Daniel Greenberg, the meeting facilitator, Mr. Jason Braganza, the executive director of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, Aphrodite. I'd also like to recognize the members of the technical working group on the public financial management who are here present with us. Also staff of SADC member parliaments, including those from parliamentary budget offices, legal drafters, and state law officers. Representatives of the media organizations, staff of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, and those of national parliaments. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome. Dear colleagues and distinguished participants, it's with immense honor that I welcome you to this consultative meeting under the auspices of the SADC Parliamentary Forum. Today, we are essentially consulting with yourselves as legal drafters who assume their functions as parliamentary staff or as staff of the Attorney General's office. In addition, we are also consulting with staff of parliamentary budget offices who are involved in the preparation of the appropriation bill and other related matters. Thus, to give situational context to this meeting, we are engaging today with yourselves as key staff who are usually public officials that are actively involved in the preparation of public financial management legislative processes on behalf of the state. Dear colleagues, as we start, I would like to thank you for attending this key event. Most of you have already participated in the forum events in the past, and thus are already familiar with the role and mandate of the SADC Parliamentary Forum and its role regarding model law making. For newcomers today, I wish to underscore that the SADC Parliamentary Forum is poised to lead in the harmonization of legal norms regarding sexual reproductive health and rights and good governance at the regional level. And the public financial management model law is another step in the right direction towards the achievement of this noble objective. Dear colleagues, according to the SADC Parliamentary Forum Strategic Plan of 2019 and 2023, prudential planning is pivotal as an enabler of democratization and socio-economic development. And the SADC model law on public financial management sets out the necessary safeguards for member states to pursue with careful financial planning and implementation under the supervision of their sovereign parliaments. Colleagues, the strategic plan of the SADC Parliamentary Forum further concentrates the need to build the capacities of staff of parliaments and legal drafters to assist members of parliament in understanding and domesticating model laws, thus your august presence to this consultative session today. Colleagues, as staff of member parliaments involved in drafting and representatives of state law offices who are lawyers by profession, you are involved in the assimilation of model law provisions into legislation. Indeed, through progressive laws brought forward by the executive, legislative staff consider public financial management norms, and you advise on the appropriateness prior to the enactment through the legislative stages of the National Assembly. You prepare and draft legal amendments pertaining to financial laws and compare different legal regimes and jurisdictions. You are also responsible for advising ministers and their staff on whether their country is compliant with international treaties and covenants, such as the anti-money laundering or CFT treaties, or bilateral instruments such as double taxation avoidance agreements or investment promotion and promotion agreements. Such agreements, colleagues, may sometimes pose significant risk to public finances and debt ceilings, and thus need to be carefully vetted by representatives of the Attorney General's offices. You'll find the model law relevant in this regard. In addition, legal drafters, you are involved in the preparation of the yearly budget legislation. Hence this benchmark tool that you will find quite useful in this endeavor. Dear colleagues, indeed every year, members of parliament diligently process the Appropriation Act, the Finance Act, which reflects the spirit of the budget measures announced. Supplementary appropriation acts, to cite but a few laws, that are relevant to the public financial management for you to be able to find relevance in this meeting today. Although legal nomenclatures may vary across the jurisdictions, the essence is that legal drafters contribute to the drafting process of multiple finance-related laws that impact on public financial management every day. At the technical level, budget officers within Parliament contribute to the accuracy of the figures that are presented to ensure that Parliament adopts a valid budget for the next financial year and valid budget forecasts over the medium term. Furthermore, yourselves who are legal drafters are entrusted with the responsibility to prepare financial resolutions, which are of utmost confidential nature. Such resolutions are passed and have legal force. On the same day the budget speech is read, in view of levying spontaneous taxes on certain products and avoid the distortion of market prices, which may occur by budget announcements, until the Finance Act is adopted at some later stage. Legal drafters also draft all legal amendments at committee stage, which refers to amendments which are proposed to be made to a bill after it has been publicly introduced in Parliament. Dear colleagues, it is also customary in some SADC member states for legal drafters to advise on offenses and sentencing provisions, especially when there are diverging views on same by different sides of the House and Parliament. In this role, legal drafters are also advisors to members of Parliament and to the clerks or secretaries general of SADC member parliaments. Hence, your involvement and analysis and feedback on this public financial management will be crucial. Colleagues, we all know that although public financial management will normally be your field of predilection, legal drafters can be advisors on public financial management through comparative analysis of differential norms that you can compare the model law to the prevailing domestic regime. The model law is a benchmark. It is a yardstick. It is not supposed to usurp the powers of legislators in your sovereign states. It is supposed to be used as a reference mark. So as parliamentary staff and legal drafters, you can thus be active proponents of a robust public financial management framework owing to your knowledge and competence and your proximity with governing institutions. Dear colleagues, today, it is expected that you consider the various provisions of the model law as highlighted by the legal drafter, and you kindly are expected to advise on the appropriateness and relevance to the modern public financial management context of your respective jurisdictions or other jurisdictions beyond yours. In particular, you may wish to consider provisions relating to Part 6 on parliamentary control and Part 7 on the national budget, which are relevant to your assignments relating to financial laws. I wish to emphasize that the model law on public financial management has expressly been designed to focus only on public financial management and to avoid dealing extensively with anti-money laundering and the financing of terrorism, that is AML or CFT provisions, or even issues related to financial licensing, such as insurance, since these will require separate legislative provisions. It was rightly opined by the SADC Parliamentary Forum's organs that these themes ought to be dealt with separately by different model laws that will be developed at the appropriate time with the approval of the plenary assembly. I'm raising these issues because consultation after consultation, we have had inputs in terms of how far the model law would have gone. And for this context, I had to put on record that although there are many other areas that could be looked at, the model law could not take everything on board. Dear colleagues and distinguished participants, by virtue of your important functions in your respective member parliaments, It goes without saying that you can be our eyes and ears at national level once the model law has been adopted by the SADC Parliamentary Forum. In addition, your advisory roles may also assist members of parliament and ministers in consolidating existing public financial management frameworks by the entrenchment of best practice, which is what the model law endeavors. Although we are aware that some of you may not have policy functions as legal drafters, still, you'll have the opportunity to monitor, the opportunity of monitoring the incorporation of the SADC model law or PFM in collaboration with your national parliament or ministry. This activity will be coordinated by the Regional Parliamentary Model Laws Oversight Committee of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, a specialized high-level committee dedicated to monitoring model laws. As parliamentary staff and as legal drafters of your country, you'll have the opportunity to make presentations at the level of the committee and submit written representation in view of enlightening SADC member parliaments on the progress made in this respect. Dear colleagues, indulge me. The forum recognizes that parliamentary staff and legal drafters are not initiators of public financial management reforms. Yet, you can be valuable allies in polishing the public financial management law and advocating for reform once public financial management legislation is on the parliamentary agenda. I emphasize this so that you are not discouraged to participate in the deliberations and engagement with the legal drafters and the learned rapporteurs. Colleagues, public financial management as we know it forms part of the dynamic ecosystem that allows democracy to thrive. Without public financial management, the ecosystem can be drastically upset, and this will have a devastating and irreversible effect on democracy. There is therefore need to safeguard this ecosystem and keep it as healthy as possible to face emerging disturbances which may later influence the stability of the SADC region. We are confident at the SADC Parliamentary Forum that as public officials, as parliamentary staff, or legal drafters, you'll all lend hands to assist us in this momentous mission. With these few words, colleagues, I wish you a fruitful deliberation and wish to apologize that in view of the IPU session that is ongoing, I will leave you at this point after the official opening as we have to transit on to Indonesia. Thank you for your kind listening.
Thank you very much, Madam SG. I see that our facilitator is already on the platform. Mr. Braganza, are you ready to take over?
Yes, thank you very much. And my sincere apologies for joining late. I just had to finish another meeting. Honorable SG, I just want to thank you very much for those very motivational remarks, because as you have mentioned, the group that we're speaking with today really not only act as the backbone that joins the different regions, the different countries in the region in terms of parliamentary processes, but also, with a civil society background that, as I have, the grouping today really also act as enablers to allow public participation in public financial management issues. And I think the role that's being played by this group in terms of the drafters and state law officers is incredibly important in not only enhancing participation, but also enhancing ownership at the citizen level of this process. And I think we have, as we've talked on many occasions during the consultations, the ownership not only at state level, but at citizen level is imperative if this trailblazing initiative of the draft SADC model PFM law is going to have success. Citizens ought to be able to engage and interact with it. And so with those short statements, I do wish to invite our keynote speaker, to join us Ms. Barbara Ntileng Tapo, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who is the clerk of the National Assembly of Botswana, and a position she has held since October 2009. She has over 17 years of experience in facilitating legislative support and oversight processes. She's experienced in governance, public participation, environmental management, performance management systems, ecotourism development, and education. She's also a researcher focusing on participatory and socioeconomic and conservation issues. Ms. Tapo is also currently the inaugural chairperson of the Committee of Clerks of Parliament of the SADC PF. Previously has also chaired the SOCAT Central Africa sub-region between 2018 and 2021, and she holds a master's in environmental sciences. Ms. Tapo, I now invite you to give your keynote address, and welcome. Please unmute. Please unmute. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a meeting. Thank you, facilitator. The Secretary General of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, Ms. Boemo Sokoma, the legal drafter of the SADC Model Law on Public Financial Management, Dr. Daniel Greenberg, the meeting facilitator, Mr. Jason Braganza, Executive Director of the African Forum on Network on Debt and Development, members of the Technical Working Group on the PFM Model Law present here, staff of SADC member parliaments, including those from parliamentary budget offices, legal drafters and state law officers, representatives of media organizations, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Distinguished colleagues, I extend my warm greetings to all of you this morning. In joining you this morning, I also accept the honor and privilege extended to me as a fellow staff of Parliament to deliver the keynote address at this auspicious occasion, convened to share ideas and insights on the development of a SADC model law on public finance management, PFM. I must say from the outset that it is a matter of great pride to all member parliaments of SADC PF that the model law on public financial management is the fifth piece in the repertoire of model legislation that has been developed by the Forum. As you colleagues may be aware, the Forum has developed model laws on HIV and AIDS, eradication of child marriages and protecting children already in marriage, elections and gender-based violence, and therefore, the PFM model law is yet another milestone by the Forum and deserves commendation. You will agree with me that the development of the PFM model law comes at a most opportune moment in the economic development trajectory of the SADC region, when good governance and robust public finance management are critical. It is a time when we are grappling not only with the dearth of financial resources, but our economies are also ravaged by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In these constrained economic circumstances, it is even more important than ever before for SADC member states to manage their resources prudently. Always bearing in mind the need for sustained quality service provision to the citizenry. I must stress in this regard that public service provision speaks to the realization of the rights of citizens, and in this vein constitute the key deliverables of the state itself. Therefore, SADC member states must strive with ever greater determination to ensure that their public financial management systems are anchored on the rule of law and best practice in order to achieve the best outcomes from the scarce resources available.
Distinguished colleagues, it cannot be denied that parliaments stand at the epicenter of good public financial management. To illustrate this, let me remind distinguished colleagues that the functions of Parliament of representation, legislation, and oversight place it at the core of the democratic process. In this regard, the public financial management process weaves through these functions of Parliament via the budget process. Let me amplify a little by way of example. In approving the imposition of taxes, parliamentarians perform a representative role by agreeing on behalf of the electorate to be subjected to those taxes. Passing the necessary tax legislation as well as the Appropriation Act or Finance Act, as the case may be, constitute the legislative function of Parliament. The oversight function is performed inter alia through budget checking, quarterly reviews of budget performance, and review of audit reports by the Supreme Audit Institution. Given the foregoing, it is no surprise that progressive legislation on PFM must thus form the core of our governance and accountability framework, as it is an important tool in Parliament that offers to execute its mandate. Transparent, results-based budget planning and execution ensure that available resources are used effectively for the benefit of all. This is underpinned by cost-efficient and transparent procurement processes in line with environmental imperatives and principles of social equity.
My apologies, Barbara. You've gone mute again. If you could please unmute. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Globally, most frameworks on PFM attest to the need for transparency and openness in PFM. One of the questions as we deliberate today ought to be whether we are living up to the expectation of citizens in our allocation and management of public finances. Perhaps before going further into the subject, let us pause a bit and critically reflect on what public finance management is really about. A systematic review of literature on PFM shows that there might not be a universally agreed definition of PFM. A traditional definition by Allen in his publication of 2004 narrows PFM to the downstream activities of budget execution, control, accounting, reporting, monitoring, and evaluation. PFM, as performed by most governments, is anchored on legal and institutional frameworks that provide the platform for supervising all phases of the budget cycle, including formulation and preparation of the budget, budget execution and expenditure management, internal controls and audit, procurement, monitoring and reporting arrangements, and external oversight and audit. As a SADC region, these are some of the areas which require our concerted action. The objective of the SADC model law on public finance management, therefore, must, among others, be to address identified gaps to provide long-lasting solutions to the challenges of financial management in the SADC region. Ladies and gentlemen, the theory and practice of change management teaches us that in order to effect change, there needs to be a burning platform. So where is our burning platform in the SADC region? Why is a SADC model law on PFM necessary at this point in time? A close analysis of the reports of Supreme Audit institutions in Southern Africa reveal that there is notable deterioration in the health of public finances in the SADC region. Reports of irregular, unfruitful, and wasteful expenditure are common. Misappropriation of public finances is a continuing challenge, resulting in spending plans not being fully implemented, a common problem throughout the SADC region. What perhaps makes this development a paradox is that the management of public finances in Southern Africa is highly legislated. It therefore begs the question as to why significant lapses still occur despite availability of PFM legislations or laws in all our jurisdictions. The observation has been that despite a multiplicity of relevant laws on public finances in Southern Africa, the country's specific legal frameworks are somewhat not fully implemented to derive maximum benefits. Is it because they are weak, fragmented, outdated, poorly implemented, and not in sync with best practices in PFM? Another observation has been that oversight roles of parliaments might have been rendered onerous by ambiguity and in certain respects, conflicting pieces of legislation on PFM. In this context, we must then applaud SADC PF for initiating the formulation of a SADC model law on public finance management. There is no doubt that the final product will guide the harmonization of PFM laws in the SADC region. The SADC model law on PFM will serve as a benchmark and guiding legal instrument for national parliaments to reinforce their domestic legal frameworks on public financial management. It will also enable parliaments to benchmark PFM best practices. This will further contribute to strengthening the legislative, budgetary, and oversight functions for public financial management in a manner that is transparent, effective, and responsive to the needs of SADC citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit that the SADC model law on PFM should ensure and encourage member states to enact laws that enhance transparency and accountability. This will prevent situations where state institutions bind the nations to unsustainable fiscal commitments, probably done in secrecy. Secrecy undermines public confidence in PFM and governance. For example, there are countries in the SADC region that have passed laws that allow the state to contract debt without seeking parliamentary approval for the same. Such laws undermine public scrutiny of the agreements of the said countries. Non-disclosure of agreements of debt may compromise public confidence in the governance processes, thus defeating the goals of sound PFM. Public disclosure and debate of all agreements before approval enhances transparency and ownership. It enhances probity of the same. The SADC model law on PFM should address this important matter because mortgaging a country's future is a recipe for instability and civil discontentment. To drive the point about transparency home, I wish to cite a prominent court case in the region where the Constitutional Court found that the state guarantees given to certain entities were null and void because they were concluded secretly and did not benefit the majority. That highest court held that the loans and the guarantees should be treated as if they never had existed. In its decision, the Constitutional Court cited the Special Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry, which found that the loan guarantees given by the state had not been authorized by Parliament and thus violated the Constitution. This case clearly shows that secrecy is not consistent with the tenets of effective PFM, a subject which should feature prominently in the SADC model law deliberations. Similar experiences have been reported where authorities have not been forthcoming with information on the total stock of public debt for those countries. Ladies and gentlemen, in concluding my remarks, I wish to reiterate that every change and new development must be data-driven if it is to make an impact. Measurement allows us to identify and develop fitting solutions for the future. I therefore wish to share a few statistics and findings that will aid your discussions today. A leading global authority of PFM, Professor Teppenhurst and others in the 2019 publication computed an index of legislative oversight tools. Overall, he computed an ex-post oversight index for 60 legislatures around the world. A high score reflects high parliamentary oversight and effectiveness, while a low score reflects low capacity and effectiveness. The highest score in Parliament was Finland with a score of 0.87, followed by Sweden with a score of 0.84, and the United Kingdom with a score of 0.82. The lowest on the index were the legislatures in Southern Africa, with scores ranging from 0.36 to 0.67. The ex-post index confirmed the widely held view that there is inadequate financial oversight in Africa, mainly as a result of existing legal and regulatory gaps in the current country systems. The systems should be the target of the SADC model law on PFM. On a related matter, Bashaka and Pago in the 2014 publication in a seminal paper titled "What Constrains Effective Public Financial Management in African Democracies? Preliminary Analysis," stated that observed that the management of government finances in Africa remains an area with substantial leakages of public resources. They observed that institutions established to spearhead PFM are perpetually at fault as the amount of public resource leakage remains unacceptably high. Every year, audited reports in many SADC countries contain scathing remarks condemning governments' handling of public finances. The annual audit reports have been explicit on issues of corruption and wasteful expenditure, among other things. The common denominator in the reports is the lack of consequence management in respect of those who misuse and abuse public resources. The SADC model law on public finance management must therefore be razor sharp in recommending severe penalties for any public official found to have acted contrary to the spirit of effective PFM. At this juncture, let me hasten to say that there is need to reflect on the definition of public official as proposed in the SADC model law, on PFM. Experience shows that the definition of public official in many SADC jurisdictions is narrow. As such, some perpetrators of abuse of public funds are let off the hook on technicalities. A robust definition must be considered as we come up with a SADC model law on PFM. It is also important to state that PFM in the SADC region is sometimes compromised by the absence of a law that protects what we commonly refer to as whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are critical cogs in the PFM governance metrics. As such, they must be given adequate statutory protection when they make disclosures to relevant bodies on issues that are central to PFM. A close perusal of the legislation in the SADC region shows that there are gaps in country systems relating to protection of whistleblowers. This is an area which we must exercise our minds on so that we come up with an effective guide for member states. It must be appreciated that while the formal implementation of PFM is the official responsibility of the executive with oversight done by Parliament, there is need for formal recognition in the model law of the role played by non-state actors in PFM. Civic society organizations, the public, and other key stakeholders must be given a role in such processes as budget formulation and preparation, as well as debt monitoring and reporting. More often than not, civil society acts as the voice of the voiceless. I do not wish to preempt the discussions that will ensue, but let me offer these 3 recommendations that I hope will generate much more robust debate as we forge ahead in coming up with the SADC model law on PFM. Model laws are great instruments for integration and standards. In dealing with model laws, it is important to know what problem one seeks to address through regulation. In other words, it is important to know what is to be regulated, why, and how. Therefore, in drafting such laws, it is imperative to have them grounded in good quality, a prerequisite for acceptability by member states. Second, the development of model laws should be informed by quality data and wide consultation among all the critical stakeholders to ensure credibility and acceptability among member states. Third and finally, the SADC PF needs to cultivate closer and collaborative relations with the various parliaments of the sub-region to engender greater political legitimacy and ability to influence sub-regional decision-making processes. On that note, let me wish you very fruitful deliberations. Thank you, Pula Raleboga. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barbara, for those very encouraging remarks, but also remarks of caution in terms of how we need to approach this process with regard to dealing with the challenges of today that affect and are afflicting the region. I liked very much the stark statistics that you shared on the legislative oversight indicators. If that is not reason enough for us to embark on this journey in using the 3 recommendations you have provided us, then we need to rethink why we're on this journey. I think it's a very stark reality that you have brought to our attention. But I also feel, in addition to that, the point that you made around constitutionalism and public financial management, particularly around financial leakages, the form of illicit financial flows, tax expenditures, as well as public debt, issues that are very prevalent and very critical to undermining the ability of the region to finance its own development agenda, and not just in SADC, across the continent. These are things that we are witnessing, that are exacerbated and made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I do thank you very much for those remarks, motivating us to think through, even in the spirit of regional integration within the SADC region, on how we embark on this journey. Dear colleagues, with that, I would like to hand over briefly to the team at SADC, the IT team, who are going to play for us a video clip that will help elucidate some of the very motivational words that we've heard from both Her Excellency, the Secretary General, as well as our keynote speaker. So I'll hand over briefly now to the IT colleagues to just play for us that video clip. Thank you.
The common perception of public financial management is that it's something very technical, that you can't understand it if you're not an accountant or a high-flying economist. But it's fundamentally about something that concerns us all, in the sense that when money is badly spent, we don't get good services, and when we as citizens don't get good services, we have less opportunities for our children and grandchildren. So in particular, in the context of a developing country, a good PFM system is usually a necessary condition for getting good development outcomes in terms of improved service delivery, reduced poverty, gender equality, etc. The problems you face in developing countries are not dramatically so very different to the problems you get in developed countries, in the sense that public finance management is about allocating taxed resources to a limited range of areas. And there's always going to be competition about what money gets allocated to and how much people should be taxed and who should be taxed. And exactly the same issues that come up, for example, in the UK general election are exactly the issues that create conflict in a developing country. Sometimes violent conflict, in other occasions conflict which works itself through the system. And in a certain sense, the idea of a good PFM system is to lay down a set of rules so that that conflict over how to tax people and how to allocate resources becomes a structured process. So rather than a conflict, it's more like a constructive negotiation. It's different people arguing their points of view. Why should there be more money for higher education as opposed to more money for electricity generation? There's reasonable points of view on both sides, and with the right set of rules, you can get that to work properly. So the very first stage is what we call policy development. And interestingly, there's no accountants involved in that. It's usually economists and sector specialists, educationalists, health specialists, people like that. The next stage is where you begin to put a framework to make that budgetable. So you calculate what are the resources available in terms of taxation, in terms of other types of resources that might come to government, what's the potential for borrowing, and on the basis of that you set a set of fiscal limits, overall limits for the process, usually within some sort of medium term. And we would describe that as the strategic programming phase. Then after the strategic programming phase, you get down to the actual budget. In most countries, it's an annual process. In the UK, it's a mix of an annual and a medium-term process. The budgeting process ends up with the executive making a proposal to the Parliament. The Parliament then votes it. Sometimes there would be amendments made by Parliament. Otherwise, it's simply approved. Then you move to budget execution, which is when the different spending ministries are allocated their credit limits or their fund limits, and they begin to spend and to achieve results, hopefully. Linked to that is a whole process of accounting and monitoring. And then the next phase is auditing and evaluation. So after the budget is finished, there's a process of examining on the audit side that procedures were properly followed and that results were achieved, and on the evaluation side that the right policies were pursued, that we couldn't have got better results with a different type of policy. And then that, of course, feeds back into the policy development process. So those are the 6 phases, all equally important, and all, as you might see, related to a range of things, not necessarily just about financial management. Virtually every country in the world has some kind of Public Finance Act. And in that Public Finance Act, that nearly always requires the executive to present a budget proposal to the legislature, to the Parliament, and it requires the Parliament to approve it. And even in more dictatorial regimes where you don't have a Parliament, there is usually some sort of a council or some kind of a body that has to give its approval to the proposals that the president might put forward. So you'd be surprised. I actually can't think of any country in the world where there isn't some process like that in existence. Of course, in some countries, the information base is much better than others. And the degree of access of normal citizens to the process is much better than others. Ideally, your policy development process should be an open process. It should, result in debates, in things on the television, on the radio, in the news, and normal citizens, as well as, academics and others with specific interests, should be able to comment. That's not always the case in a developing country. And that's one of the things that in general we should try to push in reforming PFM, to make it more transparent, to make it more accessible to people. Because obviously the more people can engage with policy debate, the more likely you are to get to better policies. Getting actors involved, it's really about 2 big things. One, it's about accountability. So the people who are in charge of getting something done, whether it's making a school run or delivering road maintenance services, they've got to feel that they're responsible for that service, and they've got to feel that they've had a hand in presenting the budget for that service. If they're just sort of given a budget and told, get on with it, then they don't take a sufficient level of responsibility for what they've done. And if something goes wrong, so if the cost of road maintenance turns out to be exorbitantly high and the results terrible, potholes everywhere, then the question is asked, well, whose responsibility is it? And what will happen is that your local government will say, well, we asked for X much money and we asked for it to be made available in January, but we got Y, which was much less, and we didn't get it until 6 months into the year. So they will negate responsibility. And then you have to ask, well, who is responsible? So the whole idea of getting actors involved is to make it clear that the team of people responsible for delivering a service have had a hand in making the budget and in deciding what results are going to be generated from that. Other actors, citizens, voters, should be involved because ideally they should have some say in what sort of priorities are chosen at the upper level and also in the ways in which services are delivered at the most local level. I think accountability is at the heart of any good PFM system. And ideally, reforms should build in accountability because the point is nobody really knows what's the best way to spend money. You know, people have researched for years what's the best way to provide education, and we end up with different models of schools or, you know, different models of healthcare or whatever it might be. And if you accept that you're always learning, then that means that having different actors providing feedback and making suggestions and telling you when they're not satisfied is always going to be a positive thing, and it's going to make the whole process better. And that's the idea, is to put across that idea of accountability. So it's not just about you know, taking people to court when they've stolen money. It's also about giving them feedback and giving suggestions and promoting learning. That's the point.
Thank you very much, SADC ICT team, for sharing us with that video. And I think it's, you know, an important point that to the basics that Mr. Lawson has presented in that video. The essence of this process is literally about getting the best value out of taxpayers' money. Because at the end of the day, when we have leakages, when we have fiscal deficits, all these become tantamount to the citizen bearing the cost of those leakages and bearing the cost of those inability to get good services out of our government. And so it is important, you know, how the journey that we're going through in terms of getting this model law drafted and passed through, that we always keep that at the center of our minds, that, you know, the benefit is for us to get good public services. And to take us through the draft model law that we have been using to consult is Daniel Greenberg, who, it's very nice to see you again, Daniel, after our initial interaction a few weeks ago. Thank you very much for being with us today. Who has a very elaborate CV. So I won't try to read it to every single word of it, but I will just give a very quick overview of who Daniel is. He's a barrister who specializes in legislation and legislative processes and currently serves as counsel for domestic legislation in the House of Commons in the United Kingdom. He also serves as the general editor of Westlaw UK, Thomson Reuters, and he has a law degree from Cambridge University and has over 30 years experience in legislative drafting and the machinery of government. He has drafted legislation, that is elaborated further in his CV, edits 2 legal dictionaries and an international legal journal, and has worked with several governments across the world, including the United Kingdom, Albania, Wales, the Falkland Islands, the Isle of Man, Gibraltar, Myanmar, Malaysia, Nigeria, Northern Ireland, Solomon Islands, South Georgia, Sri Lanka, and elsewhere on the production of legislation and legislative development processes. He has extensive experience in training and teaching legislative drafting skills, including intra-government and external consultation processes. He also writes on legislation and on the machinery of government issues. Daniel has been with us through this journey and has been taking different groups and stakeholders across the draft model law that he's put together for us. And so without much further ado, Daniel, I'll just hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, distinguished facilitator. Grateful to you and grateful to Madam Secretary General, and grateful to our keynote speaker. The point was made by both Madam Secretary General and by our distinguished keynote speaker that effective implementation of financial management legislation depends on citizen engagement and involvement. And I therefore join with you, our distinguished facilitator, and with colleagues in welcoming those citizenry of SADC member states who are joining us now by means of social media, or who will join us later by means of recorded social media. Distinguished delegates, I have two preliminary points to make before I advert to some particular features of the model law. First, as distinguished legislative drafting colleagues present know as well as I do, all legislative drafting is about balancing competing desiderata. And in the case of this model law, the requirements are to balance simplicity with certainty. This must be a model law that is sufficiently simple to enable it to be understood readily and applied smoothly. The principles must not be obscured by a surplusage of detail. However, as you, distinguished facilitator, have pointed out, this is a highly technical area. This is law dealing with one of the most complex areas of public law, and it requires to be articulated with a certainty that supports implementation at a technical level by the key target audiences who are professional and technical experts. Secondly, it requires to balance accessibility and accuracy. It must be accessible, and we have endeavored to use natural language terms wherever possible. The distinguished keynote speaker drew attention to the need to define certain terms with breadth and clarity, and she adverted to the term public officer, which is a key term which we do indeed define in different contexts. But wherever possible, the language must be straightforward, plain and simple to match the simplicity of the format. But that accessibility must not again undermine the required accuracy in this highly technical and professional area. And therefore the model law does not shy away from using technical language for technical concepts, but it does aim not to obscure the principle by the unnecessary use of technical, obscure, or archaic language. Third, there is a need to balance clarity with flexibility. The law must be stated with clarity on the face of the model law, preparing for effective domestication in each jurisdiction. But this is an area of law that is developing and changing all the time. And were we to provide a snapshot of what the law requires to provide today, we would be dooming the model law to instant obsolescence. And nowhere is this more apparent than in relation to Part 12, which deals with crypto assets and cryptocurrencies. Part 12 was expanded at the behest of the members of the technical working group, who wished to see greater specificity in relation to the regulation of crypto assets. But how do we articulate in the model law rules for the effective regulation of something the very nature of which is changing as we watch? And the answer is that we attempt to balance the necessary flexibility with the necessary degree of clarity by articulating in Part 12 broad principles of crypto regulation drawn from the London School of Economics and Political Science Institute of Global Affairs Basic Principles for Regulating Crypto Assets, 4th draft, tempered then with the necessary powers and flexibility to have a mechanism for reacting to changes in real-world events in relation to crypto assets, but always within the envelope of the cryptocurrency principles of constructive engagement, effective classification, consumer and investor protection, cryptographic and technological reflection, and constancy. But that is a particular example of how the challenge here for the model law to reflect both clarity and flexibility is particularly pronounced. Finally, we have to balance a principles-based legislative approach with the necessary enforceability, and as to that, distinguished delegates and esteemed colleagues will see that Part 2, which I will take us through in a moment, balances Part 11 on offences. Secondly, the constitutional and other legislative arrangements of each SADC member state are unique and present different degrees of specificity and concentration in relation to matters of public financial management. It is therefore necessary that the model law should avoid being prescriptive and should, in particular, provide the mechanism for enabling avoidance of overlap or worse, conflict with constitutional or other legislative provisions. Colleagues will therefore see that in a number of places there are footnotes in the model law draft drawing particular attention to the need for contextualization during the domestication transposition process, but in other respects too, throughout the draft, it is important to remember the challenges of individual domestication and contextualization. I now share my screen in order to take distinguished delegates and esteemed colleagues through a few specific aspects of the model law. I invite the Secretariat to confirm that colleagues are now able to see my screen.
We can confirm that we can see it.
Thank you. Part 2 of the model law deals with aims and objectives, and it includes...
Daniel, sorry, my apologies, Daniel. If I may humbly request you to just increase the size of your screen just beyond 110%, that might most be appreciated. Wonderful, thank you so much.
Is that better?
Much better, thank you.
Thank you. I also note there's a certain amount of background noise from one participant who might like to mute their microphone. Part 2 deals with aims and objectives and articulates in clause 9 a purpose provision, which is, as esteemed colleagues will recognize, not here merely part of the preamble. It is an operative purpose clause requiring the courts, in accordance with the principles of administrative law, to construe and apply the later obligations of the model law in accordance with the principles of accountability, transparency, independence, and modernity through an efficient and effective process in relation to each of the raising of public revenue, the expenditure of revenue and resources, accounting for receipts and expenditure, and parliamentary oversight. Clause 10 imposes a justiciable duty on public officials to aim to optimize revenue and expenditure and to prevent unauthorized expenditure, to improve sustainability and to ensure that parliamentary accountability and oversight is effective. To that end, Clause 10.2 requires the designation of measurable benchmarks for testing success and achieving those outcomes linked to the reporting and recording functions under the Act. Clause 11 identifies the public financial management principles as being transparency, accountability, and participation, including formal and meaningful opportunities for the public of all classes to engage in the process, including the national budget process, the oversight principle, and the responsibility principle. And public authorities are given an enforceable duty to have regard to, within the classic administrative law meaning of that term, the public financial management principles in accordance with the values which are articulated as integrity, independence, impartiality, equity, professionalism, accountability, and responsiveness. Clause 13, in closing part 2, draws attention to the need for contextualization in domestication, to which I alluded earlier. Part 3 identifies and sets the parameters for the responsibilities of the key authorities, the finance minister, the finance secretary as the permanent civil service head of the financial structure, with the functions of the finance secretary and the powers of inspection, the nature and functions of the finance ministry, and the designation of accounting officers as heads of each accounting unit within government, along with their general functions. Part 4 deals with the public funds with which public accounting will be concerned, and deals with the mechanism of payments into and out of the consolidated fund. It also deals with other accounts, including retention accounts, trading accounts, and the debt servicing account. And at an earlier consultative forum, we were invited to consider additional provision about special funds, which we have agreed to take away and do. Part 5 deals with the supply and appropriation process, again to be balanced against the specific constitutional and other legislative provisions in each domesticating jurisdiction. It deals with applications and appropriations, including appropriation in aid. Part 6 deals with parliamentary control. In accordance with a parliamentary engagement principle, which, in pursuance of the need for the model law to avoid being prescriptive, locks into the mechanisms available to each parliament, lists them in a non-exhaustive way, and places emphasis on the role of standing orders and other local processes in determining how this principle should be operated in practice. The Auditor General's duties, status are then set out, including emphasis on the independence of the Auditor General from the executive and the accountability of the Auditor General to Parliament. Clause 40 establishes the National Audit Office, and the functions of the Auditor General are established in clauses 41 to 43. The Public Accounts Committee is established by Clause 44 for those jurisdictions that do not establish it already under their constitution. It deals with membership and functions, again, in accordance with the standing orders and other procedures of Parliament in each jurisdiction. Auditor General's reports are dealt with in Clause 46. Clause 47 picks up a point made by our distinguished keynote speaker today about citizen engagement by requiring the Public Accounts Committee to operate a public complaints portal system. And this links with, as our distinguished keynote speaker expressly alluded to, whistleblowing protection, which is fundamental to effective enforcement of an accountable and transparent public financial management regime. Part 7 contains the components of the national budget structure, which will be familiar to the distinguished delegates and esteemed colleagues, including the purpose of transparency and accountability, including fiscal transparency and parliamentary control arrangements to make sure that in each jurisdiction, Parliament has an opportunity to object to individual budgetary proposals, to require the implementation of specific recommendations, and to give or withhold approval to particular components of the public financial management system. In this respect, I draw attention, with your permission, Mr. Distinguished Facilitator, I draw your attention to one minor inaccuracy in the account given in the video clip to which we listened a moment ago. There is in the UK no method for amending a component of the budget proposals, and I would not expect that to be a standard process of most systems. There is a requirement for the actions set out in paragraphs A to C of Clause 51, subsection 1, always subject to standing orders and with the oversight of the Speaker and all sides of the Parliament. Annual appropriation and virement, again, the concept of virement being required to recognize the need for flexibility against clarity. Virement is required, but it has to be within an envelope of overall control. And in this sense, the speaker in the video clip was correct that relaxations or elasticity in the process must not give rise to complete dilution or undermining of the principles adumbrated in Part 2, to which I have already referred. The budget process is detailed in clauses 54 onwards, including estimates, and the budget debate, which aims to enact the citizen engagement principle. Specific mention is made of documents to accompany the budget in the interests of accountability, transparency, and oversight. Departmental objectives, a sustainable fiscal policy statement, sustainable development goals statement, international commitment and project statement, an equality and diversity statement to emphasize that equality and diversity are at the heart of equitable public financial management of a kind to which you, distinguished facilitator, referred to in your remarks a moment ago. Past year and future year implication statement, and a multi-year budget protection statement alongside a public debt statement. In-year developments, again, balancing flexibility with clarity, national adjustment budgets, in-year budget reports, delayed budgets, pre-budget expenditure, withholding of appropriated funds and unauthorized expenditure, all provided for within a flexibility that, again, does not dilute or undermine the envelope of overall oversight and control. Part 8 deals with government borrowing, and starts with classification of public debt. Another item which, if I may say, with great deference to our distinguished keynote speaker, is another term like public officer, where definitional challenges can undermine the effectiveness of the provision if they are not addressed at the outset. So there is a requirement for classification of public debt in a way that is broad and includes some specific issues to which I will return in a moment. The debt management strategy and committees are required to oversee the process, and the authority to borrow and the borrowing arrangements give rise to a range of flexible and broad concepts, including the broadest concept of the issue of securities through agents or otherwise, which are required to be registered to maintain transparency and clarity. I alluded a moment ago to the need for a breadth in classification and embracing the widest concepts of government debt, and the fasciculus introducing by clause 80 deals with, in particular, on lending, guarantees and indemnities, all of which are methods of enhancing state liability and therefore require to be brought within the public debt framework. Public debt statements accompany the budget report, and a debt schedule is required to be attached to the budget accompanying document, public debt statement. The provisions in the fasciculus about the debt ceiling are again not attempting to be substantively prescriptive of what is appropriate for each jurisdiction, but they trigger particular transparency and accountability scrutiny arrangements in the form of excess reports and enhanced scrutiny, and that is their purpose. Part 9 deals with procurement and the use of public resources in a way that will be familiar to distinguished delegates and esteemed colleagues, including again the flexibility to vary the system in emergency without losing the oversight and transparency system. Part 10 deals with public accounts on a resource account basis, which colleagues will recognize as being in accordance with best international practice rather than a pure cash management system, and on a whole of government account basis for the same reason, to provide a fair and accurate overarching assessment, permitting effective scrutiny by the Auditor General. Part 11, to which I alluded earlier, introduces a definition of public official that suits this particular part in its breadth, that will be explained by the nature of the offences being created, public financial misconduct, and misuse of public funds. In each case, the penalties will require to be articulated in accordance with a proportionate and coherent approach in each jurisdiction that reflects the criminal and penal code of the jurisdiction concerned. Maladministration is not identified as a separate offence in the public financial management, whether or not it is in the jurisdiction's criminal code already. In accordance with the separation of powers, it is an identification of maladministration in a report of a parliamentary or other investigation or inquiry, and it therefore does not give rise to penal sanctions. It gives rise to disqualificatory sanctions in accordance with the separation of powers. Part 12, I have already referred to in relation to crypto assets, and I finally draw attention in Part 16 to the flexibility achieved by the power to make supplementary regulations and to give guidance in relation to matters of administrative process or procedure, but always subject to the scrutiny and oversight of Parliament, which is provided for expressly. Distinguished facilitator, I hope this gives distinguished delegates and esteemed colleagues some oversight of the provisions of the model law as drawn so far, and I thank distinguished delegates for their attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel, for walking us through the draft model law as it is evolving. And certainly, at least from whence I had my first interaction with this draft, I can see such a number of inclusions that have come through, particularly on the cryptocurrencies. And I do hope for distinguished colleagues who are on the call today will have some comments, some ideas, as well as inputs in how to continue this process of strengthening this model law as we go on this journey. And I think with that, I would like to open up the screen for colleagues to use the raise hand option if they wish to make some submissions and some comments. And in terms of order, if you could please just briefly introduce yourself, the country you're representing, and then task your question or comment to Daniel for us to discuss further. Alternatively, we could use the chat function. If you wish to type in your question in the chat box, I'll be happy to then move it on to Daniel for comment. And so I would like to take this opportunity to open up the floor at the screen for colleagues who would like to come in at this point. If you wish to raise your hand, please do put your hand up so that I may see who it is and bring you in. Thank you. Please feel free. This is a safe space. We do want to ensure that we capture colleagues' opinions. I have Henry McGregor from South Africa. Please come in. You have the screen.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Henry McGregor. I'm from the Parliament of South Africa. I'm the head of the Treasury Advice Office. I'm not a legal drafter, to qualify that. And my experience deals mostly with external audit and public debt management. So my comments for now will be on those subjects. We will submit written comments as well, probably in the next month, if that is okay. So I will start with external audit. I do have a concern surrounding the independence of the Auditor General, or the National Audit Office, as the law calls it. The INTUSI, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, have done extensive work on ensuring independence within four Auditors General. Particularly the Mexico Declaration and the Lima Declaration. One key feature, I think, is that we recognize, which is a good feature of the law, is that we recognize that the Auditor General is independent of government. However, we subsequently then gives the Minister of Finance the power to regulate, to put in place regulations to govern the Auditor General's function. So for me, that is an issue. Principle 7 and 8 of the Mexico Declaration deals with Principle 8 deals with the autonomy of the Auditor General, and one of those is administrative and financial. So in the INTUSI community, which is a body of all Auditors General, this is a very contentious issue because it allows the Minister of Finance to set the budget by which oversight is rendered. And this has, over the number of years, curtailed the work that the Auditor General does. So that is one of the areas that I think we need to look at. Another responsibility in terms of the duties is an explicit responsibility in terms of a follow-up mechanism, because it is not only for us for the Auditor General to report on the financial accounts, the yearly accounts, but also important to follow up on the previous year's commitments that were made. But in doing so, ensuring adequate oversight. So for now, I think I will put that forward for consideration, but we will submit the detailed report. I will move to public debt, if that's okay. The law explicitly mentions that it empowers the Minister of Finance to do certain things, but the fact that it's a law, Parliament delegates its responsibility to future generations debt service payments. Now, it gives the minister a lot of power in this sense, and I think we need to strengthen how we regulate that. In some cases, the law is specific that members or the minister is delegated the authority, but we assume that authority is delegated in the law. A very important conversation that has been going on in the debt community is the definition of debt. I like the fact that we talk about classification of debt, but however, the definition of debt has been a contentious issue. We do mention guarantees, however, we don't explicitly mention contingent liabilities. So, which is in an accounting definition is something totally different from a guarantee. So I think we need to look at that. There are guidance from the IMF on that. In terms of the classification of sub-regional, classification of debt, we mentioned government, and I think the implication is that when we speak about government, we speak about all organs of state. However, in some countries, sub-regional governments are revenue-raising entities, so meaning they can actually fund their own debt payments. In most of our countries, 70 to 80% of the revenue comes from central government. So then we might need to include the definition of sub-regional government into that definition or classification to ensure we capture all debt. Yeah, I think I'll also then comment on the debt management strategy. I like the fact that there's provision for debt management strategy. I would also include maybe in some cases, in some countries, the objectives of debt management is included in the law. However, it's more flexible to include it, to prescribe what we have to include in the debt management strategy. For example, a debt management strategy could be to deepen local markets. We know that South Africa is probably one of the few, but a debt management, how can I put it, function is to deepen local markets, but it could also have another objective. So it's clear that the strategy must have an objective and it must have goals so that the public is clear on what we are trying to do with debt. I like the fact that there's a debt schedule provision. However, we could also include what that debt schedule should include or what it should comprise of. For example, details of lenders, composition of debt in terms of currency, whether it's local, whether it's US dollars, whether it's euros. We could also include the maturity of debt as well as the interest rates. So those are a few comments on what we should be looking at, but also maybe a specific section on debt reporting. We mentioned a public debt statement. We mentioned a few statements that's made along the budget, but maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a consideration whether debt reporting should be treated as a separate section in the Act. I know it's scattered, but whether when and how we report should maybe be brought out clearer. For now, I think that's the only notes that I have made on those sections, and we will submit a written submission at a later stage. Yeah. Thank you.
Henry, thank you very much for that very detailed commentary on external audit and issues around public debt. I know Daniel will come to this. I do have one comment in the chat box to Jailosi. I presume, yes, the SADC team will make the presentation and the speeches available to all colleagues. So please keep an eye on your inbox for that. Daniel, before I hand over to you, I just wanted to add a couple more points just to get your thoughts on this. The issue of debt management authorities or offices being independent of national treasuries or ministries of finance. We've seen that there are some attempts to do this globally by way of best practice and to create independence. Sort of following a similar track of the revenue authorities and central banks in order to maintain that autonomy and that objectivity in terms of how the administration is done. I wonder whether in this journey of developing the PFM law for SADC, whether debt management offices might be one of these areas. The second point is really building on the cryptocurrencies that you've talked about as being a sort of an additional aspect that we're considering. The dynamic aspect, one thing we're beginning to see now on the continent is the introduction of digital currencies by central banks, and to the extent to which this model law may want to be dynamic, as you referred to, and have a consideration around that. Thank you. And dear colleagues, if you've got any comments, please raise your hand so that we may ensure we capture your comments and your reflections. Thank you. Daniel.
Enormously grateful to distinguished colleague from South Africa for the penetrating remarks that he was kind enough to make. The issue of independence of the auditors is one that was raised at an earlier consultative forum with Auditors General, and we have undertaken to take this away and revise. The problem which no one has yet been able to answer satisfactorily, and we look forward to written submissions that come up with suggestions on this point, is to the extent that regulation is required in relation to the processes, who is properly placed to provide that regulation, if not Parliament through subordinate legislation laid by the minister. And I think, if I may say so, I think different jurisdictions have different traditions in relation to the provenance of subordinate legislation. But in many jurisdictions within the SADC member state region, in many jurisdictions, Parliament controls subordinate legislation, but the executive is required to promote it because no one else is in a position to do that. The distinguished delegate from South Africa, I think, suggested that regulation in respect of the financial management of the auditors themselves was unnecessary. And he will forgive me if I misunderstood him in that respect. And I think in some parts of the world that has been the experience, but not in all. And the systems that I have been involved in have achieved this balance of independence and reasonable degree of regulation by parliamentary oversight of regulations, of executive regulations. We will remove that provision because it clearly does not find favour with a number of SADC consultees, but what to put in its place has not yet been adumbrated by responses. On the question of contingent liability, I refer to the provision in clause 79(1)(b), that relates to potential liabilities, and contingency is obviously a particular form of potentiality, but I have no difficulty in introducing that as an additional term specifically. State-owned enterprises and sub-regional governments are dealt with in these parts of the model law that apply the principles to those levels and layers with modifications. On the content of the debt management strategy and the content of additional debt reporting duties, I will look with particular care at the written responses from the South African delegation when they are kind enough to submit them. On the question of independence of debt management offices, again, we could provide for that expressly. The model law at present achieves that through the interrelationship between debt management and the audit and parliamentary oversight mechanisms, but we could provide for that expressly. And my only comment in relation to central bank digital currencies and part 12 is that I think it is clear that any jurisdiction that decided to introduce a central bank-backed crypto asset or digital currency, and of course I use the phrase backed there in a deliberately vague sense, because that is indeed fundamentally the problem of crypto assets valuation. But any bank that did, any central bank that did decide to introduce its own, to issue a digital currency of some kind, would, I think, inevitably be required to promote legislation for that purpose. And that legislation would be able to add a layer of flexibility to that already achieved by Part 12.
Daniel, thank you very much. We now turn to the Senate at the Democratic Republic of Congo. Bonjour. You now have the screen.
Merci beaucoup de nous avoir accordé la parole. L'intervenant de l'Afrique du Sud a posé un problème crucial sur la gestion de la dette publique. Alors, il a parlé de ce problème que nos chez eux, là, ils demandent les éléments qui peuvent constituer le dossier de la gestion de la dette publique. Alors, nous disons que nous pouvons prendre l'exemple de la République démocratique du Congo, qui est presque en avance par rapport à cette problématique, parce qu'en République démocratique du Congo, nous avions déjà une structure qu'on appelle OGDEP, Office de gestion de la dette publique. Alors, c'est cette structure-là qui s'occupe de la certification de toutes les dettes de la République. Alors, quand il fait le travail de certification et pour la certification,
We can hear you. Please proceed. Oh, I see he's okay. Sorry, I see he's frozen. Yes. Yes, please do. Please do, Mr. Interpreter. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I think as we wait for the technical issues to be resolved in the DRC, if there are there any other additional comments or clarifications that colleagues would like to put forward to Daniel at this point? And might I just emphasize that this is a very useful exercise for the technical working group that's working with Daniel in putting together this model draft law. So all the ideas and the comments and the submissions that you're feeding us with are really contributing to the strengthening of this model law. So also encourage colleagues to submit as Henry in South Africa has mentioned that they will be doing, and I know colleagues at SADC PF will provide those details. We have about 20 or so minutes slotted remaining. So are there any burning issues or comments or questions that colleagues would like to raise at this point as we wait for the DRC to come back online? If not, we may start the process then of closing the session in that case. I don't see any additional comments in the chat window either. Okay, yes, I have Simon Tambo. You have the screen.
Yes, so this is Simon from the Parliamentary Budget Office in Zambia. I just want to take your comments on the finance committee, the PS Finance, where the chief controlling officer is the the PS Finance. I'm just thinking, I don't know other jurisdictions, we have what they call the Secretary to the Treasury. And I note under that the functions more or less are speaking to the ST as opposed to the PS Finance. And in any case, the PS Finance in these ministries, there could be many. There's under PS budgets. I was thinking maybe the connecting part or the right office should be the ST, Secretary to Treasury, as opposed to the PS Finance. I don't know what your comment could be on that. I also note that in most jurisdictions now, as related to Auditor General's office, and I think this might have come out during the previous meeting, they are now undertaking what they are calling performance audits, and certain PFM acts are taking care of those. Have we tried to take care of the performance audits in this our law? Maybe you might wish to talk about that. So Mr. Samuel, I saw budget debate in the law. Would it be better if we replace that with approval or authorization as opposed to having debates? I don't know if that could be too much to ask. Those are a few comments I thought I should bring out, and I was hoping that maybe you can help me understand those few things that I've just highlighted.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your question and comment. We did have a little bit of a challenge. If you could please mute. There's a lot of feedback coming from your side. We did have a bit of a challenge getting the full question, but if I may repeat it, you did ask about clarity on the finance committee with regard to whether the chair should be the PS Finance and not the Secretary to the Treasury. And you did then ask about budget approvals and whether it should be about approvals or debate. If I've got your comment or question correct, I'll hand over to Daniel. I am aware that the team from the Democratic Republic of Congo are back online. So Daniel, if you want to take Simon's question and comment first, and then we'll go back to the DRC for them to complete their comments.
As to the balance between the responsibilities of the Treasury and the Finance Ministry in each jurisdiction, as I said, that is a matter for contextualization in the domestication process for each jurisdiction. In relation to performance audits, again, that is a matter on which there will be domesticating flexibility, but I will look forward to seeing what the distinguished delegate from Zambia believes would be encompassed by those performance audits, and we will look very carefully to introducing a provision along those lines. As to the nomenclature in relation to budget, debate, approval, and authorization, again, that is a matter for contextualization during the domestication process.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel. And we'll return now to the DRC. You have the screen. Please, pardon, please unmute. Please unmute.
Oui, nous disions que la RDC est en avance déjà par rapport à la problématique de la dette publique, parce que nous disions que la RDC a déjà une structure qui s'occupe de la dette publique. Alors, cette structure qu'on appelle OGDEP, donc Office de gestion de la dette publique, qui rassemble ou qui coordonne toutes les activités de la dette publique, mais à son tour qui fait rapport au Parlement. Alors, avant de faire le rapport au Parlement, il doit y avoir tout un dossier qui constitue chaque créancier. Alors, cette structure-là qui fait le travail de contrôler qui est créancier, qui ne l'est pas, et qui est vrai créancier et qui est créancier fictif. Alors, si vous avez une créance à la République, donc vous devez être d'abord reconnu officiellement par l'État congolais comme entrepreneur ou personne morale ou physique et avoir tout un dossier complet et être en ordre avec le fisc de la RDC. Alors, c'est à ce moment-là qu'on va vous classer sur la liste de créanciers ou de bénéficiaires. Alors, quand on fait le travail, l'office termine à faire le travail, il envoie le dossier au Parlement et à la Cour de compte et à l'exécutif. Alors, maintenant, si ça arrive au niveau de l'exécutif aussi va faire le travail qu'on appelle la certification de la dette publique. Si on certifie réellement que non, nous avions une dette de X ou Y, c'est à ce moment-là qu'on peut passer soit au paiement ou à une autre étape. Mais ça ne se limite pas seulement là. Nous avons encore une grande institution qu'on appelle la Cour des comptes. Donc, c'est elle qui s'occupe du contrôle a posteriori de la gestion de finances publiques. Alors, qu'est-ce que la Cour des comptes fait? Après avoir fait exécuter les dépenses pour le budget de l'année, alors avant la fin de l'année, il descend, il envoie ses magistrats ou ses conseillers dans les différentes institutions pour aller faire le contrôle, ce qu'on appelle l'audit, mais c'est le contrôle de la Cour des comptes. Donc, il fait le travail, après avoir terminé à faire ce travail-là, ils font les rapports généraux de ce qu'ils ont constaté. Est-ce qu'il y a eu une bonne gestion dans X ou Y institution? Alors, à la fin, il fait les rapports qu'il doit soumettre à l'approbation du Parlement et l'Assemblée et le Sénat, compris les deux chambres réunies, et il va déposer la copie aussi à la présidence et à l'exécutif. Alors, maintenant, au niveau du Parlement, de prendre les rapports là à bras le corps pour en faire sien et faire le suivi de ce qu'il y a eu dans ces rapports-là. Est-ce qu'il y a eu mauvaise gestion, il y a eu bonne gestion dans telle ou telle autre institution. Donc, c'est comme ça que les choses se passent en République démocratique du Congo. Peut-être qu'il y a aussi mon collègue qui peut compléter.
Merci beaucoup. S'agissant de la crypto-monnaie, nous remercions la loi type qui a été élaborée par le comité de la SADC. C'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, le flux monétaire qui circule à travers le pays mérite une gestion rationnelle. Et d'ailleurs, cette loi type est tombée à point nommé. Nous souhaiterions que, effectivement, cette loi type serve à ceux que, dans la plupart de nos pays, que cela soit réglementé par la loi et que nous puissions canaliser tous ces flux qui est en train peut-être d'échapper à la gestion publique de l'État. Nous vous remercions.
Merci, colleagues in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and very much appreciated the description of the process that takes place. Daniel, did you want to come back on any of those submissions?
Enormously grateful to distinguished colleagues from the Democratic Republic of Congo for their penetrating analysis of the debt management process in their jurisdiction. We will look at their written submissions with particular care to see whether there are features of the mechanism that he has outlined that can be imported into the model law without jeopardizing its generality of application, and whether there are refinements incorporated in the system that he has described, which are not merely different nomenclatures, but are indeed different features and enhancements that we could incorporate into the provisions of the part 8, and we will review the material with particular care in the light of his extremely penetrating analysis.
Wonderful, thank you, Daniel. I don't see any other hands in the chat in the participants list, nor any additional comments in the chat window. Safe to say, colleagues, what I've done is building on the commentary from the colleagues in the Democratic Republic of Congo, have shared in the chat window a link to an example of what is happening in my country, Kenya, with regard to creditor registers or debt registers. This is a public document, and I hope it will also serve as a feedback to what the colleague from the Democratic Republic of Congo mentioned about the listing of the creditor, the amounts, the terms and conditions, the duration, and any other comments to serve as a sample or as an example of what is being done in other parts of the continent. Certainly, distinguished colleagues, the main feature, it seems, from today's discussion really has been around the issue of public debt, which started off with the comments and the speech by Her Excellency the Secretary General, and were followed through by our keynote speaker, and certainly by the contributions by distinguished colleagues from different countries represented. And I know the working group, together with Daniel, will take these very important commentaries and feedback on the debt issue and cryptocurrency. It seems as being, one of the big takeaways from this particular consultation, and find ways of integrating them appropriately and adequately in the model law. If you allow me, if there aren't any other further comments or questions or clarifications from distinguished participants and colleagues, I will just ask, by virtue of protocol, if the colleagues at the SADC Parliamentary Forum would like to come in the last 5 minutes to give some closing remarks. I do know the SG excused herself because of having to travel, but I don't know if there's any representative from SADC PF who might want to give some quick closing remarks. And here I will seek guidance from the IT colleagues if they would guide me appropriately.
Oh, we've lost them again.
Thank you, Jason. This is Yapoka. I'm the Director of Finance and Corporate Services at SADC PF. Just to advise that there will be no closing remarks because the Secretary General is currently in transit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yapoka. And so, distinguished colleagues and representatives from the SADC parliaments and legal drafters from across the region, and to colleagues at SADC PF and Daniel, our legal drafter. I think with that, we will bring this session to a close. We are most grateful for your time and your energy in making this process very consultative, very open, and very progressive as SADC PF trailblazes a model public financial management law for the region. We are open to receiving submissions by email. I know the details have been shared with you by colleagues at SADC PF, so please do submit them so that we may integrate them as much as we can through this process. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the week. Continue to stay safe and stay well. Thank you and goodbye.